Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Jared Meyer, fellow at the Manhattan Institute and co-author with Diana Furchtgott-Roth of Disinherited, How Washington is Betraying America's Young. Jared, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Bill.
Jared, for 50 years, our government has fed the growth of massive programs that take care of citizens from cradle to grave. Government spending on everything from healthcare to education has soared. We've enacted regulations to protect both the environment and the workplace. And while we're not quite up to where the Europeans are, we're certainly getting there. So why are millennials the first generation in American history whose economic prospects are worse than their parents?
Well, if we look at the debt level right now, that's worse than it's ever been. But that's just on the face. Maybe if millennials were actually able to get jobs and start contributing to the economy and earning some money, the debt wouldn't be such a big deal. But this recession and then the slow recovery that's followed have really left young Americans behind. If we look at the unemployment rate for those between 20 and 24, it's pushing 10%.
Yeah.
That's over twice as high as the rate for those over 25. And it gets even worse when we look at the teenage unemployment rate at 17%. So it's not only that they're going to eventually have to pay this crushing debt burden off, but they're getting a slow start to their careers, which means they can't start saving their own money and worrying about their own retirement when they first have to fund the retirements of older Americans.
Before we get into how you millennials are going to dig your way out of the hole, let's look at the depth of the hole, and let's start with Social Security. Experts tell us the Social Security Trust Fund is destined to run dry, not too distant future. What's actually in this trust fund right now?
Well, it's really, using the word trust fund is almost misleading, because Social Security has been sold as an investment program, not an entitlement, not a welfare program. Instead, it's something that people have spent their whole careers paying into. And in some ways, they're right to think, I've worked my whole career, I've paid into this, I deserve all the money I'm going to get. When I talked with my grandpa, when I was putting the book together, I was laying out my argument to him, and he's like, what are you talking about? I've paid into Social Security all this time. I deserve every dollar I get. And I had to explain to him that all the money I'm paying in now is going directly to him. There's no time for it to start accumulating savings and for it to become a real retirement vehicle for young people like myself.
So where did the money your grandfather, or the money I paid, where did that money go?
It went in the terms of higher promise benefits, what I like to call unfunded promises, to older retirees. In politicians, it's extremely popular to just keep saying you're going to get more and more paid out in Social Security, and they sold a false bill to Americans. They said these are paid for. You see it every few weeks on your paycheck. They kept paying it out in higher and higher promised benefits and not really taking into account, well, hey, don't we want this program to be here for the rest of the country?
So Congress has already spent that money and put IOUs into the trust fund?
Yes, so they've spent it in the form of higher payouts to current retirees and past ones.
So isn't the Social Security Fund already bankrupt?
In a way, it is already bankrupt, but if it continues on its current track, it will actually have to start cutting benefits that are paid out in the 2030s. But the way it is right now is that it's not bringing in enough money to continue its, long-term horizon of accounting. So in that way, it is bankrupt.
Well, I'm 4 years from sticking my nose in the trough. I'm certainly going to enjoy my $2,600 a month. I've got to expand my single malt collection. Your generation is going to have to pay for this. Where are they going to get that money?
That's a great question. And when I talked to a lot of millennials when I was writing my book, I found out that a lot of them don't even expect to ever get a cent back. They told us, they view it as another tax. And they say, it's important to take care of elderly Americans. They want to, make sure their grandma's not starving at Christmas and everything like that. But they don't see it as a program that they're paying into that they're going to justly get a return on, if they get anything at all.
Well, that's so generous of you, but that doesn't end there. We could look at some other big numbers. I see Chicago's in the news again. They've just had their bonds rated junk because they're unable to reform their pension programs, particularly their teachers' pension programs. When you add it all up, what does the unfunded public employee pension programs look like across the country?
It's pushing $5 trillion now for states. Keep in mind, that's on top of the national debt, which is commonly reported as $18 trillion. But when you look at Social Security, Medicare, all of that, it bumps it up to then $200 trillion. These are unimaginable numbers. I don't know what $200 trillion, a stack of $200 trillion looks like. I can't even wrap my head around this. And I think most Americans, when they hear trillion, they're like, oh, I don't know. That's just too big. There's no way you can reform it. And they kind of just accept it. Whereas if it was something they could wrap their heads around, they would realize the giant outrage that's going on right now.
But the politicians today are making promises that have to be kept by politicians tomorrow. And those politicians of tomorrow have no place to go but your paycheck.
Well, hey, it's a perfect system. I mean, whoever came up with that found how to kick the can down the road and keep passing it on to future generations. I mean, it's evil, but it's, evil genius.
So far, we've just talked about the hole in the ground for pensions. What about health care? Where are we in Medicare world right now?
Medicare is in even worse shape than Social Security and will be depleted even quicker. I mean, again, returning to my grandpa, I love him and everything, but his 2 knee replacements and back surgery weren't cheap. I remember one time he was laying out what he paid into Medicaid versus, the hundreds of thousands of dollars his surgeries cost. And this isn't a rare occurrence. This is something that's happened all across the board where older Americans are able to take advantage of a pretty generous healthcare program, but they didn't pay into it to the level that would be required to get those benefits.
Sounds like a great deal for us. I mean, and in fact, it's getting even better with Obamacare. And my understanding is that the only way Obamacare works is to get young, healthy people like yourself into the program to cover us older folks.
Well, and that's why you saw the big push by the White House to try to get more young invincibles, they were termed, to sign up, because they knew if these young people who only spend, it's about like $600 a year on health care is the average, according to government data, that shows they spend that much on health care. Yet their premiums under Obamacare skyrocketed, upwards of 90% for 27-year-old males. So they're paying thousands of dollars for health care that they really don't want or need. I mean, when you've got ads coming out that show a millennial in a onesie pajama, drinking hot chocolate, and it says, like, talk about getting covered, like, with a hashtag and everything, that's when you know you're getting really, really desperate to sign up young people for the Affordable Care Act.
Well, what is it with your generation? Can you guys do arithmetic?
Well, if we wanted to get into education eventually, I don't think the arithmetic isn't as much of the problem, because one thing that I found actually pretty exciting when I was doing this research was almost 3/4 of young Americans think that reforming Social Security should be a top priority for the federal government. As to what's going on with that other 25%, I don't know if they just want to ignore the problem or they really like paying more. But, they see there is a duty to take care of elder Americans in their view, but they do realize that Social Security's broke. They're not going to get any of this back.
So I'm trying to understand the politics of the situation. Every time a fiscal conservative or libertarian gets up and tries to reform entitlements, their progressive opponents start shouting, war on women, and you folks just flock to the progressives. Why does that dynamic keep working?
You're right. It is almost that we're, people who want reforms to the system, they're too scared to attack what is seen as, the third rail of American politics. They don't want to wade too deep into it, and they reform kind of little tweaks around the edges that it's like, well, in 100 years, everything will be balanced out. So we really have to have an honest conversation where, instead of treating income inequality, climate change, talking about all these things as the defining challenge of our time, even if we do want to treat them as a challenge, I still think they pale in comparison to how America's treating its youngest generation. That's the defining challenge of our time, and we need to change the debate so that we're not proposing just little tweaks around the edges.
So, Jared, if you add all this up, the Social Security bankruptcy, the public employee pension bankruptcy, the Medicare bankruptcy, the Obamacare taxes, what is your tax bill going to look like in the years ahead?
Well, just looking at the federal debt, if we wanted to pay this off, it would immediately require a 57% increase in all taxes or a 37% cut to all federal spending except our ballooning interest payments. And if we want to go then to the state level, each American would have to pay upwards of $13,000 right now just to cover their state's unfunded liabilities. So this is really a monumental burden that not only will definitely show itself years in the future, but if we wanted to write this now, it would be insanely expensive at a time when household savings and net worths are, low, especially for young Americans.
So, Jared, it's kind of theoretical explaining to a millennial that in 15, 20 years they're going to have to carry an enormous tax burden, but they're carrying a very big burden today the minute they graduate, which is their student debt. Where are we on the college loan front?
It's worse than it ever was before. Student loan debt's now pushing 1.2 trillion, and people are graduating with an average of 27,000 in debt. And this is 70% of graduates. This isn't something just, a minority has to do. This is becoming the new normal. You need to go pretty deep into debt in a way that will burden you for a long time into the future just to get a college education, which, throughout your life, everyone in the media and your high school guidance counselors and everyone have been saying, just go to four-year university. It's what you have to do. It will always pay off.
Well, when I went to college 40 years ago, my MIT tuition was $3,500 a year. Where are we today on the tuition front?
Well, when we look at college tuition, it's absolutely ballooned. It's increased over 1,000% since records began being kept in 1978. Now, over that time, food costs have only risen by 240%. So this isn't something where it's, just tracked other goods getting more expensive. The value of a college tuition, you can argue that's increased, but it's hard to argue that it's increased by over 1,000% since the late 70s. And because of this, student loan debt has increased. I've already laid out the overall numbers, but it's not just the $27,000 for the average. If we're looking at people owing between $50,000 and $75,000, that's doubled since 2004. The amount owing over $200,000 has tripled since 2004. This is crushing levels of debt. Maybe you can argue, as I've heard some say, that $27,000 really is manageable. You can get out of that. It might take a while, but when we're talking $200,000, I don't know where you even begin.
So what's been driving this tremendous increase in college tuitions?
I think what we see as driving the increase is the programs that the federal government has put in place to try to make college more affordable. This seems kind of odd. You would think, well, if we can, provide easier access to loans and allow more people to go to college, maybe that will lower the price. But it turns out it's done just the opposite. I think the easiest way to understand the federal government's student aid program is they're writing a blank check to colleges and just saying, here you go. No matter what level you increase your tuition to, no matter what type of opportunity you provide graduates with,
we'll cover it.
We're going to go ahead and subsidize it for you.
And how many of these educational programs are actually leading to job skills that are valuable in the marketplace?
That's an interesting question because I laid out the unemployment rates, which are really high for recent graduates, but we can look at the underemployment rate, which means you're then, after college, going and working for somewhere that didn't actually require you to go get a degree. And that's an astonishing 44%.
Wow.
Up from 34% in the early 2000s. So college graduates, you hear about them, going and working at Starbucks. That's a real thing that happens all the time. And if we do look at the unemployment rate, too, now it's 8% of graduates younger than 25 are unemployed. They're not coming out of college with a full-time job offer right away, which used to be the case. I mean, back in the Clinton administration, it was half the rate at 4%. So this is something that's gotten worse as well.
And what's happened to the workforce participation rate among the young?
Oh, that's absolutely plummeted. We're now talking, if we look at the overall picture of young people participating in the labor force, it's at its lowest record since the governments began keeping records in 1948 at about 55%. So when you have just over half of young people participating in the labor force, I mean, how are they going to start earning their own money, saving for their own retirements? But hey, I guess when you can live in your parents' basement, maybe it's not that bad. We've got an all-time high of Americans 18 to 24 living at home, 56%. That's over half are living in their parents' basement.
And you could stay on their health care plan until you're 26.
Well, I love how the Affordable Care Act was sold with that while ignoring that it would have to increase prices for young Americans. Because if we looked at before the Affordable Care Act, which was by no means optimal, young people had to pay about 1/5 of what older Americans had to pay for their health care. Now, by law, they have to pay 1/3 because they want to make sure that the costs stay down for people on the high end or older Americans, so they had to bump up the cost for younger Americans.
What's preventing millennials from looking out for their own self-interest? For example, don't go to a college that's too expensive you can't afford, don't take giant loans, and don't study a major that has no value in the marketplace.
I really think it's a lack of information. I mean, if we're going to have the government tied this deeply into the higher education system, I actually welcome President Obama's initial calls last year to start maybe some sort of ranking colleges and setting interest rates based on how successful they are at finding graduates jobs afterwards. I mean, the federal government, don't get me wrong, they have a terrible track record of correctly setting interest rates, but I don't see how they could do worse than what they do right now, which is the same rate of 4.66% applying to everyone, regardless of major, regardless of school, work history, past academic success. If we're going to have the government spending all these billions of dollars per year on student loans, tax credits, grants, they need to have some way to decide, send some market mechanisms to students on if this is something I should pursue or this is something I should push off. And I've heard pushback on this saying it, would just favor wealthier Americans and what about poor ones? Well, hey, let's have a lower interest rate apply to community colleges, which are already extremely affordable at about $2,500 a year.
Sure.
So, that could be a way, and then take into account community college success into it. There are ways to work with this to alleviate concerns, but the general point is just the status quo right now is unacceptable. And at least people, even President Obama are realizing this.
Wouldn't offering better financial terms to engineering majors than, say, gender study majors be unfair? And doesn't your generation hate unfairness?
Well, you're right that millennials claim to hate unfairness, but if we're going to treat higher education as an investment, which is the reason that we're spending all these taxpayer dollars on it, I think you should actually treat it as an investment. Let's be honest, you're probably not going to get a return on your degree if you're a gender study major at an expensive 4-year university. Whereas if you even go to, a state school, many of whom have great engineering programs, and study that, I'm not in venture capital myself, unlike you, working in that, but I could see a good investment, and I think that is one right there.
Jared, in your book, you spend a good deal of time talking about the impact regulations have had on millennials entering the workforce, particularly occupational licensing. Share a little bit of that with us.
Sure. So occupational licensing, it's something that kind of flies under the radar. People always talk about unions or minimum wages or all these other labor market regulations that they see. It's either harmful, helpful, somewhere along that line. But occupational licensing is one of the things that has really exploded as of late. What it is, the easiest way to understand it is that you have to get the government's permission slip to work. So back in the 50s, it only was about 1 in every 20 American workers needed to get this.
Yeah, like doctors or something.
Yeah. Doctors, accountants, maybe financial advisors, dentists, things like that. Now it extends to over 1/3 of the workforce, and this makes no sense because the whole point of occupational licensing, at least in theory, is to keep the public safe. But when we have people like hair braiders and interior designers and florists all being required to get the government's permission to earn a living, that is a major problem. And this isn't as easy as just, showing up to your local post office and mailing. I mean, maybe that's not even that easy these days. But this is something that takes years. In the case of interior designers, they have the biggest uphill battle to starting work, even though they're only licensed in 4 states. The average is 6 years of training. That's 6 years. I was trying to do the math once and figure all the different occupations you could work for, but just to put it in some perspective, it only takes 33 days to become an EMT, where you're literally holding lives in your hands. I think there's a slightly bigger risk to public safety from an EMT than from mismatched drapes.
Well, who controls these licensing boards?
This is one thing where Washington actually isn't fully to blame. It's state governments. State and local governments are especially easy for special interests to exert their influence on. So what they do is establish practitioners of a craft. Let's say, an obvious example, let's take taxi drivers in New York City. They're really threatened by ride-sharing services such as Uber and Lyft. So what they do is band together and create, through strong political pressure, an effective cartel where no one else can come into work. They control the rates, and they work to protect themselves, not to protect consumers. So Uber's business model, what they did was kind of say, these occupational licenses are so ridiculous, we're just going to operate outside the law. And because services suffered so much because of the effects of decreased competition, the public's going to get behind us, and we'll just go around the law, and then they'll make a new legal set for us. But this isn't something, again, that just happens in one sector of the economy. This is widespread, and the same battle Uber's facing is going on all across America.
And this is certainly affecting millennials when they try to hit that first rung of the career ladder.
Yeah, just one that I want to pull out is tour guides in some college-heavy cities, just to name a few: Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
They have to gain government certification, take tons of tests, pay money before the government allows them to earn money while walking and talking. Again, I'm no constitutional scholar, but I'm fairly certain walking and talking are covered. It's somewhere in the Bill of Rights. So I don't understand how the government can make a case that tour guides are, again, posing a threat to public safety. And I understand, when I visit Charleston, I want a really qualified tour guide, but thankfully the government doesn't seem to realize this. There's programs such as Yelp or Google Reviews.
Mm-hmm.
I can figure out if you're going to give me a good tour, or if I just want to hang out with someone and figure out where the good college drinking spots are, hey, I'll hire that tour guide.
Sure. Jared, let's swing back around to demographics and try to get a bigger picture. Going all the way back to Otto von Bismarck, who invented Social Security, these pay-as-you-go entitlement schemes have always been designed with a pyramid in mind. Lots of young people coming in at the bottom, old people die off by the time they're 65, 67 years old, and the numbers kind of balance. How's that starting to look for your generation?
It's not looking good, and one reason, if you showed Social Security to Otto von Bismarck or FDR today, maybe they'd be really happy seeing what it's turned into, but it's definitely not what they imagined. Now, Social Security is paying benefits to 58 million people. That's 1,000 times more than in 1937. So the program is 1,000 times bigger in terms of numbers of people.
Well, we're living longer.
That's true. We are living longer, which is great. When Social Security was first created, it was for the people who broke above the average and lived a little bit longer. And back then, poverty among older Americans was a problem, and this was a way to address it. But now it's ballooned from some sort of social safety net to just an all-encompassing retirement scheme, disability scheme, things that, the original program never had its purview.
And then if you look at demographics, with your generation coming out of college with debt, living in your family's basement, delaying marriage, delaying family formation, where are the next generation of babies supposed to come from to support you?
Surprisingly, I would have expected America's birth rate would have fallen even more, but it has, been falling not at a really high rate, but this is something that over the long term, just a small drop in the birth rate when you've got fragile entitlement programs to begin with can be catastrophic for them. And again, do you really blame millennials for not wanting to get married or have kids when they're facing $27,000 in debt, the prospect of paying down state unfunded liabilities, and, supporting these completely broke entitlement systems? Plus, even to mention that a lot of them can't even get a job, or a job that they invested in their college education for.
It's not as bad as Japan and Italy suffering from plummeting birth rates, because we always have fresh immigrants coming in the door.
Yeah, that is one way. You would think right now, especially because immigrants, at least for a while, they're not able to receive any of these government benefits. Like, hey, they're just paying into it. That could be one way, bringing in immigrants. And if we look at the Hispanic community, they skew much younger than other demographic groups. So increasing immigration could be a way to shore up these systems, because people are paying into them with really no intention of ever collecting on their own. A lot of them will leave, go back to their home countries after they've made some money. They're not coming thinking, man, I can't wait till I'm 60, in my 60s and I can start receiving Social Security. No, they're like, I need to get out of here. I need to go to a place where I can actually work and earn some money. So I think a real conversation about immigration would also help solve this.
So, Jared, you've convinced me that my generation has totally screwed your generation. What are you going to do about it?
Well, it's kind of hard because, as you know, and as I'm sure most of your listeners know, if you want to have influence in politics, you need to be well organized, you need to have some money, and you need to get Congress members' ears. And it's kind of difficult to compete against the AARP, who spent $25 million on lobbying just in the 2012 presidential election, and more than $16 million even for the midterms. They're in the top 1% of donors consistently. So how do you compete with that, creating an organization that fights for young people? It's really tough and hard to imagine that this doesn't exist right now, because everyone cares about young people. I haven't heard the last time that a politician got up on the stump and said, we just need to take away opportunity from young Americans. We need to restore the American way of, screwing over young people. That's not what people are pushing for. This has been kind of an unintentional betrayal of our nation's youth, but very real. It's when all these well-intentioned programs, or in the case of occupational licensing, terrible intentioned programs, all come together to create a systemic problem that holds millennials back.
So, Jared, for millennials who are getting alarmed about this and want to get involved, can you recommend any youth groups they should look into?
Sure. If they're in college right now, Young Americans for Liberty and Students for Liberty both offer great opportunities for them to get more politically engaged. You know, they can participate in debates, going to conferences, hearing speakers talk about this, and it's a way to kind of move to the forefront of the movement to reclaiming America's young. And also afterwards, there's America's Future Foundation and Generation Opportunity, which work to connect young, free market, liberty-minded individuals who want to, make this right and are kind of sick of the way that they've been treated.
So, Jared, I appreciate you sharing all this with us. I will certainly think of you every time I spend your money. Thanks for being on the show.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me.
That was Jared Meyer from the Manhattan Institute here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Real Clear Radio is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. If you'd like to help us expand, please stop by realclearradio.org and hit the donate button, or contact us to become a corporate supporter. That wraps up our show for this week. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.